unaware his pregnant wife owned the company. His entire family worked for cheating husband and mistress, poured dirty water on her at the gala, calling her a loser. What she did next crushed them completely. The dirty water hit Victoria's face like a slap from reality itself, cold and chemical sharp, soaking through her hair and running down her neck to stain the fabric stretched across her pregnant belly. Dylan held the empty bucket with both hands, his chest heaving like he'd just completed something physically demanding, while his mistress Amber clung to his arm and laughed so loudly that conversation stopped in concentric circles spreading across the ballroom. Patricia stood 10 feet away with her hand pressed against her pearls, her expression registering shock but not quite disapproval, while Cameron continued filming and Melissa's face split into a grin that showed too many teeth. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight but didn't move. Dylan was senior, director of client relations. His family controlled 4 departments, and the pregnant woman dripping mop water onto the marble floor was nobody he recognized from the employee directory. Victoria blinked water from her eyes, tasted industrial cleaner on her lips, and felt something inside her chest that had been carefully sealed crack open like an egg, revealing what had always been inside. She'd signed Dylan's employment contract 5 years ago using her lawyer's signature, approved his mother's hiring through her proxy board member, rubber-stamped his brother's inflated salary through her CFO, and promoted his sister based on fabricated performance reviews she'd never personally read. All because she'd wanted her husband to love her without the complication of her money, without the calculation she'd seen in too many eyes before she'd learned to hide her success. The gala sparkled around them like a stage set, ice sculptures melting slowly near the seafood tower, champagne pyramids defying gravity, men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns celebrating profits Victoria's strategies had generated. Dylan dropped the bucket and it clattered against the floor, the sound sharp enough to make several executives flinch. "That's what you get for showing up where you don't belong," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who believes they're finally saying what everyone else is thinking. Amber pressed against him, her smile victorious, her eyes scanning the crowd for approval. Patricia moved closer to her son. Cameron lowered his phone. Melissa whispered something to a cluster of marketing associates, and the family constellation tightened around their golden boy, who'd just put his loser wife in her proper place. Victoria's hands moved to her belly, protective and trembling, while dirty water dripped from her chin onto the marble floor she owned. The orchestra fell silent. 300 employees held their collective breath, and somewhere in Victoria's chest, patience transformed into something sharp enough to cut. But what would Dylan's face look like in approximately 90 seconds when he discovered the truth? And could anyone survive what Victoria was about to do next? In this story, you are going to learn the importance of not underestimating others, power of humility, the danger of judging by appearances, the consequences of betrayal, karma, integrity, and the strength found in strategic silence. Before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. Victoria's phone vibrated against the bathroom counter at 3:47 a.m., the screen illuminating Dylan's name above a message clearly not meant for her. "Can't wait to have you screaming my name again tomorrow night." The words glowed in the darkness of their master bathroom, the one she'd renovated last year with heated marble floors and a rainfall shower Dylan had requested, while her husband slept in their bed 20 feet away, his breathing steady and unburdened by guilt. She'd discovered the affair 3 weeks ago through a careless mistake on his part, a notification that flashed across his laptop screen during breakfast while he was pouring coffee. Amber's name attached to a photo Victoria's brain had refused to fully process until later, alone, when the nausea had nothing to do with her pregnancy. The betrayal had carved something hollow inside her chest, but the pregnancy made leaving complicated in ways her pre-baby self would never have understood. She was building a human, being inside her body, cell by cell, and that human being deserved a father who chose to stay, rather than one bound by court orders and resentment. Victoria set the phone down and studied her reflection in the mirror. Dylan never looked at anymore. 6 months pregnant, her body had transformed into something he'd stopped touching around week 12. His excuses evolving from tired from work to stressed about the Henderson account to eventually nothing at all. Just the empty side of their bed and the sound of his car leaving earlier each morning. She'd built an empire, quite literally built it from bankruptcy court documents and failed business models, but she couldn't build a marriage that her husband wanted to inhabit. The irony tasted bitter as the industrial cleaner that would hit her face in 72 hours. 5 years ago, she'd been celebrating her first major acquisition, a failing mid-size firm with good bones but catastrophic leadership, when she'd met Dylan at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He'd been charming in an effortless way, complimenting her briefcase before asking what she did for work, and she'd lied without thinking, administrative assistant, because the truth had ended too many potential relationships before they began. Men said they wanted successful women, but Victoria had learned they meant successful up to a point, successful in ways that didn't eclipse their own achievements, successful in theory rather than practice. Dylan had seemed different, attentive, and genuine, interested in her thoughts rather than her bank account. And when he'd proposed 6 months later with a modest ring and an honest speech about building their future together, she'd convinced herself the deception was temporary. The company acquisition had closed 2 weeks after their courthouse wedding, her lawyer handling every signature while Victoria maintained her fiction. Dylan had landed his job at what he believed was a competitor firm through his own networking, his resume strong enough that nobody questioned the hire, and Victoria had watched from her anonymous position as owner, while he'd climbed from associate to senior director through a combination of competence and family connections she'd quietly approved. Patricia had joined operations when Dylan mentioned his mother needed work after his father's death. Cameron had secured sales when Dylan suggested his brother deserved an opportunity, and Melissa had landed marketing when Dylan casually mentioned his sister's potential during a board meeting Victoria attended via conference call using a voice modulator. She'd built cages for herself, bar by bar, decision by decision, each lie requiring 10 more lies to maintain structural integrity. The pregnancy had been unplanned. A brief reunion after weeks of distance when Dylan had been almost loving, almost present, almost the man she'd married before Amber had apparently offered something Victoria's success couldn't provide. The validation of conquest, the thrill of something forbidden, the fantasy of a woman who needed him rather than one who'd secretly built the kingdom he worked in. Victoria's hand moved to her belly, feeling the flutter of movement that still surprised her. Despite its increasing frequency, this child would never know a father who'd once loved its mother, would never experience the version of Dylan who'd existed before resentment and entitlement had carved away everything genuine. She'd protected him from the truth of her success, and he'd responded by finding someone he believed more deserving of his attention. The math didn't balance, couldn't balance, would never balance, no matter how she tried to reconcile the equation. Her phone buzzed again, Amber responding with promises explicit enough to make Victoria's throat tighten, and she made a decision that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. The annual gala was in 3 days, a celebration of the company's 5th year of record profits under mysterious new ownership, mandatory attendance for all senior staff and their families. Dylan had mentioned it last week, offhand, saying he'd be bringing someone special, and Victoria shouldn't wait up. He hadn't meant it as cruelty, just fact. His assumption of her powerlessness so complete, he'd stopped bothering with deception. Victoria would attend, but not as the wife he'd dismissed, as an observer, a witness to the life he'd built on foundations she'd poured. She'd watch him with Amber, watch his family celebrate their comfortable positions, watch the empire she'd created sparkle without anyone knowing her name. And then, perhaps, she'd finally understand what she'd been protecting by staying silent. Or perhaps she'd simply confirm what her 3 a.m. heartbreak had been trying to tell her all along. Some cages were never meant to be escaped, only endured. Victoria entered through the service entrance while camera flashes exploded at the main doors, capturing Dylan's arrival with Amber positioned against him like a trophy he'd won through strategy rather than luck. The red carpet stretched 15 feet from the valet stand to the marble lobby, and Dylan worked it like someone who'd been practicing, his hand possessive on Amber's lower back while she angled herself for optimal photography, her scarlet dress catching light in ways that suggested professional styling. Victoria watched from behind a concrete pillar, her clearance maternity dress suddenly feeling less like camouflage and more like evidence of every choice that had led her to this moment, hiding in the shadows of her own success. While her husband celebrated with a woman who didn't know his favorite breakfast, or the nightmare that woke him sweating twice a month, or the scar on his shoulder from a childhood accident he'd described during their second date. The ballroom had transformed since this afternoon's final walkthrough, Victoria's event coordinator executing the vision she'd approved via encrypted email. Crystal chandeliers refracted light into rainbow patterns across marble floors polished to mirror finish. Ice sculptures depicting the company logo melted artfully near seafood towers that cost more than Dylan's monthly salary, and champagne pyramids defied physics in the center of tables laden with hors d'oeuvres from the caterer Victoria had personally vetted after sampling 43 different menus. The orchestra tuned instruments in the corner, their presence a last-minute addition she'd approved when the entertainment committee had requested additional budget, and everywhere she looked, people celebrated profits her strategies had generated, wearing clothes her wire transfers had funded, drinking champagne her decisions had purchased. Dylan moved through the crowd like royalty greeting subjects, his mother, Patricia, materializing at his elbow within seconds of his entrance. She wore navy silk that probably cost $3,000, her hair styled in a way that required professional maintenance, her jewelry understated but unmistakably expensive. All of it possible because Victoria had approved her operations director salary at Cameron's request during a board meeting she'd attended virtually. Patricia kissed Dylan's cheek, acknowledged Amber with a smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes, and said something that made Dylan laugh with genuine warmth Victoria hadn't heard in months. Cameron joined them next, his sales director swagger evident in his tailored tuxedo and the way he clapped Dylan's shoulder like they'd accomplished something together rather than separately benefited from Victoria's anonymous generosity. Melissa completed the constellation, her marketing director confidence radiating as she air-kissed Amber and whispered something that made all 3 women laugh, while Dylan accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter. Victoria's hand instinctively protected her belly as she watched the family tableau, this constellation of people who'd built their security on connections rather than competence, who'd grown comfortable in positions they'd never earned through merit, who'd convinced themselves their success was self-made, despite the invisible hand that had lifted them into place. She'd done this, created this monster of entitlement, this ecosystem of people who believed they deserved what they'd been given, this family that had taken her husband and transformed him from the courthouse romantic into the man currently brushing Amber's hair behind her ear with casual intimacy. The gala officially began at 7, speeches delivered by executives who reported to a board that reported to a mysterious LLC that reported to Victoria's personal attorney. The CFO thanked our visionary leadership without naming names. The COO praised unprecedented strategic direction without acknowledging sources, and the entire room raised glasses to celebrate success nobody properly credited. Dylan stood near the champagne fountain with his family arranged around him like courtiers. Amber's laugh carrying above the orchestra, Patricia's hand resting on Cameron's arm, Melissa filming everything for social media feeds that would caption this as family winning together. Victoria remained in the periphery, watching Dylan's eyes scan the room with proprietary satisfaction, watching Amber lean closer to whisper something that made his expression shift from contentment to something sharper. Amber's gaze had locked onto Victoria, recognition flashing across features perfected by procedures and professional makeup, and the whisper that followed made Dylan's entire body stiffen in a way Victoria recognized, the physical manifestation of anger he'd learned to suppress in professional settings, except apparently rage at his pregnant wife's presence superseded professional courtesy. Dylan turned slowly, his eyes finding Victoria across 40 feet of celebration and expensive cologne, and his face transformed through surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked disturbingly like pure hatred. His mouth formed words Victoria couldn't hear over the orchestra, his hand reaching for Amber's wrist, his body already moving before his brain had apparently finished processing the decision. Patricia's head snapped around following her son's gaze. Cameron's phone rose instinctively to capture whatever was unfolding, and Melissa's expression shifted into something predatory as the family recognized their opportunity. Victoria watched Dylan drag Amber toward the service hallway, where yellow maintenance buckets lined the wall, dirty mop water still cloudy inside them from the pre-event floor cleaning, and she understood with crystal clarity that her husband was about to cross a line that would shatter whatever remained of their marriage. Her hands moved to cradle her belly, protective and trembling, while Dylan's fingers closed around the nearest bucket handle. The family followed like sharks drawn to blood, their comfortable positions making them confident, their assumed power making them reckless, their complete ignorance of Victoria's identity making them catastrophically stupid. Amber's stilettos clicked against marble as she matched Dylan's stride, her smile victorious and vicious, her body language screaming triumph as they approached the woman she'd stolen a husband from. The bucket sloshed in Dylan's grip, gray water catching light from the chandeliers Victoria had selected, chemical cleaner mixing with tracked-in grime from the parking garage she'd repaved last spring. Patricia didn't stop her son. Cameron didn't lower his filming phone. Melissa didn't question the cruelty about to unfold. They simply circled closer, witnesses to what they believed would be a justified humiliation of a woman who'd dared enter their world uninvited. Dylan stopped 3 feet from Victoria, close enough that she could smell Amber's perfume mixing with the industrial cleaner in the bucket, close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, close enough that she could read the contempt in his eyes that used to hold something resembling love. "You shouldn't have come here," Dylan said, his voice low and dangerous in a way she'd never heard before, and then he lifted the bucket with both hands while Amber's laugh cut through the orchestra, and 300 employees slowly recognized something dramatic was unfolding near the service entrance. The water hit Victoria's face with the force of Dylan's accumulated resentment, cold shocking her system while chemical cleaner burned her eyes and dirty liquid soaked through her hair to run in rivulets down her neck. The impact made her stumble backward, her hands flying from her belly to her face instinctively, and for 3 seconds, the only sound in the ballroom was Amber's triumphant laughter, echoing off marble and crystal. Dylan dropped the bucket and it clattered against the floor with metallic finality, the empty vessel rolling slightly before settling near Victoria's feet. And his voice, when he spoke, carried across the sudden silence with perfect clarity. "That's what you get for showing up where you don't belong." Amber pressed against Dylan's side, her red dress brilliant against his tuxedo, her smile so wide it looked painful, while her eyes scanned the frozen crowd for validation. Patricia's hand remained pressed against her pearls, her shock registering as surprise at the method rather than objection to the action itself. while Cameron's phone captured every angle and Melissa whispered something to a cluster of marketing associates that made them cover their mouths. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hand hovering near his radio before dropping back to his side. Dylan was Senior Director of Client Relations. His family controlled 4 departments, and the pregnant woman dripping filth onto marble was nobody whose defense justified risking employment. Victoria wiped dirty water from her eyes with shaking hands, tasted industrial cleaner on her lips that made her gag slightly, and felt the crack inside her chest widen into something that couldn't be sealed again. She'd protected these people, literally paid their salaries, approved their promotions, funded their comfortable lives, and they'd responded by turning her public humiliation into entertainment. The ballroom remained frozen in tableau, 300 employees watching with expressions ranging from horror to fascination to carefully neutral professionalism, nobody moving to help because helping meant choosing sides, and choosing sides meant risking positions they valued more than basic human decency. "Security," Victoria said, her voice quiet but carrying in the silence that had swallowed the orchestra and champagne fountain bubbles and every conversation that had been happening before Dylan's cruelty had commanded attention. The guard near the entrance straightened slightly, confusion crossing his features because the woman giving orders was dripping mop water and looked nothing like anyone authorized to command anything. "Call Jennifer Morrison from HR and James Patterson from legal. Tell them Victoria Hunter needs them in the ballroom immediately." Dylan's laugh came out harsh and disbelieving, his arm tightening around Amber's waist, while his family moved closer in unconscious support. "Victoria needs them? You don't get to need anything here. You don't work here, you don't belong here, and you sure as hell don't get to start making demands after crashing our celebration." His voice had risen slightly, confidence growing as the crowd remained motionless, as his mother nodded agreement, as Cameron continued filming what he clearly believed would become legendary footage of Dylan finally standing up to his worthless wife. The ballroom doors opened and Jennifer Morrison entered first, her sharp navy suit and no-nonsense expression recognizable to every manager as the company's HR director, who'd terminated executives for lesser violations than what 300 people had just witnessed. James Patterson followed immediately behind, his gray suit and weathered face marking him as senior legal counsel, the man who'd protected the mysterious owner's identity for 5 years. Both their eyes found Victoria simultaneously, their expressions shifting from concern to understanding to something that looked almost like relief as they crossed the marble floor without acknowledging anyone else. "Ms. Hunter," Jennifer said, using the surname Victoria had kept separate from her married name, the identity she'd protected through 5 years of marriage and anonymous ownership. "We're here." The name landed like a grenade in the silence. Ms. Hunter, the mysterious owner everyone speculated about, but nobody had met. The strategic mind behind 5 years of record growth. The anonymous benefactor who'd transformed bankruptcy into empire. Patricia's hand dropped from her pearls. Cameron's phone lowered slightly. Melissa's whisper cut off mid-syllable, and Dylan's face went through a complicated sequence of expressions that started with confusion and ended somewhere near dread. "Jennifer, I need you to prepare immediate termination paperwork for Dylan Bennett, Senior Director of Client Relations. Also, Patricia Bennett, Operations Director, Cameron Bennett, Sales Director, and Melissa Bennett, Marketing Director." Victoria's voice remained steady despite the dirty water still dripping from her chin, despite her shaking hands, despite the baby moving inside her belly like it could sense the seismic shift happening in the world outside. "Effective immediately causes assault on company property against the owner. They'll receive minimum severance as outlined in their contracts, nothing more." She turned to James, her voice gaining strength with each word. "James, I need you to file assault charges against Dylan Bennett and Amber Whitmore. I also need divorce papers drawn up immediately. Cite physical assault, adultery, and irreconcilable differences." Dylan's laugh started as disbelief before dying in his throat as he watched Jennifer pull out her tablet and begin documenting everything as he registered the way every executive in the room had gone completely still as Patricia's face drained of color and Cameron finally lowered his camera and Melissa took an unconscious step backward. "This is insane," Dylan said, his voice cracking slightly on the second word, his arm loosening around Amber's waist as reality began penetrating denial. "You can't, she's not, this is some kind of joke." "Ms. Hunter owns this company," Jennifer said, her HR director authority cutting through denial like surgical steel through infected tissue. "She has owned it since 3 months before your employment began, Mr. Bennett. She approved your hiring, your family's positions, every salary increase, every bonus, every benefit you've enjoyed." She turned to the security guard who'd remained frozen near the entrance. "Please escort Mr. Bennett, Ms. Whitmore, and the Bennett family members from the premises. They are no longer authorized to be here, and Ms. Whitmore is now trespassing on private property." Amber's face had gone sheet white, her confident smile collapsing as she processed that the woman she'd helped humiliate owned everything, controlled everything, had the power to erase not just careers but press criminal charges that would follow them forever. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand reaching for Dylan's arm, but he'd gone rigid as understanding crashed through his reality like a wrecking ball through carefully constructed delusions. Cameron's phone slipped slightly in his grip, the video still recording, capturing the moment when entitlement met consequence and shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. "Victoria," Dylan said, her name foreign in his mouth after weeks of avoiding it entirely, his eyes wide and desperate as the security guard moved closer with backup materializing from other entrances. "We can talk about this. I didn't know. We can fix this. Please, the baby." Victoria looked at her husband, the man she'd loved enough to hide her success for, protected enough to employ his entire family, forgiven enough to consider reconciliation even after discovering Amber, and felt nothing, except the cold water still soaking through her dress and the weight of her baby pressing against her bladder. "You knew exactly who I was when you poured dirty water on your pregnant wife, in front of 300 people," she said, her voice steady and final as a closing door. "You just didn't know what I owned. That's not the same as not knowing. And my baby deserves better than a father who assaults their mother." James stepped forward with his phone already pressed to his ear. "I'm calling the police now to file the assault report. Ms. Whitmore, I'd advise you to secure legal representation immediately." Amber made a choking sound, her red dress suddenly looking less like confidence and more like a target, her hand releasing Dylan's arm completely as the reality of criminal charges registered on her cosmetically perfected features. The security team reached Dylan's family as the ballroom remained frozen, as phones rose to capture the fall of the Bennett dynasty, as executives who'd worked alongside Dylan for years backed away, like proximity to his destruction might prove contagious. Patricia tried to speak but only managed a choked sound. Cameron's bravado had evaporated entirely as he realized his filmed evidence would be used against them in court, and Melissa had tears running down her face as the security guard gestured toward the exit. Amber stumbled backward on her stilettos, already pulling out her phone with shaking hands, probably calling a lawyer she couldn't afford without Dylan's inflated salary that Victoria had been funding. Dylan looked back once as security guided him toward the doors, his face a map of everything he was losing: position, family security, freedom from criminal prosecution, his marriage, his child, the woman he'd betrayed his wife for, the comfortable fiction that his success had been earned rather than given. Victoria met his eyes across the marble floor she owned, and in that final moment before he disappeared through The service entrance where maintenance buckets still sat with dirty water inside them, she saw him truly see her for the first time. Not as the woman he'd married and dismissed, but as the architect of everything he'd just lost, and the force that would now dismantle every remaining piece of his constructed reality. The ballroom doors closed behind the Bennett family with decisive finality. Jennifer approached Victoria with a handkerchief. She accepted gratefully, wiping chemical cleaner from her face, while 300 employees processed what they'd witnessed. Ms. Hunter, I'll have all termination paperwork completed within the hour. Security footage has been preserved for the police report and any civil proceedings. James nodded beside her, already typing notes. Divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. The assault charge will move forward regardless of any settlement offers. The orchestra tentatively resumed playing. Conversation slowly restarted at reduced volume, and Victoria stood in the center of her empire, finally visible, finally acknowledged, finally free from the cage she'd built one lie at a time. Her phone vibrated, probably Dylan, possibly his mother, definitely someone who'd just realized the magnitude of their mistake, and Victoria declined the call without looking, her hand moving to her belly where her child moved like it understood that everything had changed. She'd lost her husband, exposed her identity, destroyed a family's employment, initiated criminal proceedings, filed for divorce, and somehow felt lighter than she had in 5 years of marriage. Jennifer cleared her throat gently. Ms. Hunter, perhaps we should move this celebration to the executive suite. Give you privacy to— No, Victoria said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, with the decision that formed without conscious thought. I've hidden long enough. If I'm going to own this company publicly now, I should probably start by attending my own gala. She walked toward the ballroom proper, dirty water still dripping from her hair, her clearance maternity dress stained beyond salvation, her face bare of makeup and her dignity intact in ways that expensive clothes could never provide. Executives parted to let her pass, their expressions ranging from awe to fear to something that might have been respect. And Victoria moved through her empire, finally visible, finally powerful, finally free to be both the woman who'd built kingdoms and the one who'd learned, at devastating cost, that some foundations weren't worth protecting, and some secrets weren't worth keeping, and some people would only see your value after you'd stopped hiding it from them. The champagne fountain bubbled beside her, crystal chandeliers fractured light across her face, and somewhere in a service hallway, a yellow bucket lay on its side, empty of dirty water but full of the consequences that would follow Dylan Bennett, Amber Whitmore, and the entire Bennett family for the rest of their professional lives and beyond. Victoria raised her hand, and a waiter appeared instantly with champagne she accepted, despite not planning to drink, the gesture symbolic rather than practical. 300 employees watched her hold the glass up to light that transformed dirty water stains into something that almost looked intentional, almost looked like armor, almost looked like exactly what happened when someone finally stopped protecting people who'd never protected them back. To truth, Victoria said to the ballroom that had gone completely silent, to the employees who'd watched her humiliation and transformation, to the empire she'd built in secret and would now own in daylight. And to understanding that power doesn't require announcement, it simply requires action. She didn't drink, couldn't drink, but the message landed like thunder rolling across mountains, echoing in spaces Dylan's family would never occupy again, reverberating through the kingdom Victoria had built and would now rule, without apology, without hiding, without ever again mistaking silence for weakness or protection for love. Moral lessons delivered. Never judge someone's worth by their appearance or current circumstances. True power doesn't require constant display or validation. Protecting people who don't protect you only enables their worst behavior. Silence can be strategic strength, not weakness. The consequences of cruelty often come from unexpected sources. Entitlement built on unearned position crumbles when truth arrives. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is finally revealing who you've always been. Actions have legal and personal consequences that can't be undone. Viewers, do you think Dylan deserves a second chance? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.